Welcome to the Stellar Vault. Say hi in the comments to awaken the archive. Then like, subscribe, and let the tale begin.
The first thing that failed was the portside thermal relay, then the secondary coolant feed, then the attitude thruster array on the ventral spine. Crewman Doss put his hand on a bulkhead to brace, and the metal was hot enough to peel skin, which meant the internal buffer was gone too, which meant Barrow Scat had already known for 6 minutes and had not said anything because he was busy. "Scat," Doss said. "Working." "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm not talking to you." Dren Voss listened to the exchange and let Scat work. That was the job, knowing when the answer was already happening and getting out of the way of it. He stood at the center console of Kander's Reach and watched the star fill the forward display and did not comment on how large it had become. KV-Sothran 7 was not supposed to look like this up close. Every model said red, diffuse, bloated, a supergiant in its final stage of dignified collapse, shedding mass slowly, predictable, categorized. What filled the display was none of those things. It pulsed. Not the slow rhythmic throb of stellar physics. Something irregular. Something with gaps in it, like breathing interrupted. The corona spiked and flattened in patterns that had no business existing in a natural object. The color shifted at the edges, not gradients, not emission lines. Shifts, like static in a transmission trying to resolve. It did not look like a dying star, and it didn't behave like one. Voss had read the coherence quarantine file 3 times on the transit in. Protocol 9, declared 291 years ago. Observation only. No approach within 4 stellar radii. No response to anomalous signals. The file was thorough, well-reasoned, and completely silent on what the anomalous signals actually contained. That silence was the reason Kander's Reach was here. "Commander?" Halvard Ahn did not look up from his console. He had the particular stillness of someone who had found something and was not yet sure what to do with it. "Radiation index just crossed threshold 9. "Noted. Our shielding is rated to 6. "Also noted." Halvard looked up then. Young face, precise eyes, the kind of careful that came from being right too often in environments that punished being wrong. He did not argue. He went back to his console. Doss was at the medical station getting his hand wrapped. The heat had burned through his gloves. 2 other crew were rerouting power around the dead thermal relay, working in focused silence, hands moving faster than conversation. The Kander's Reach was not a warship. It was not a science vessel. It was a salvage and survey hull, reclassed for hazardous zone operations, which meant it was built to take damage and keep functioning rather than to avoid damage in the first place. That distinction mattered here. The proximity alarm tripped. Not the star, the other direction. "Contact," said the nav officer, Prath. "Transit signature, heavy tonnage, coherence configuration." Voss turned. The vessel that resolved on the rear display was 3 times the length of Kander's Reach and built like a statement of intent. Smooth, dark, geometrically precise, in a way that human ships were not. Coherence hulls were grown, not welded. They had no visible seams. They did not look like they had been assembled. They looked like they had always existed and had simply chosen to be ships. The signal came in 4 seconds later. Layered tonal frequencies, translated by the ship's linguistics package into flat text because human auditory processing could not hold the full meaning of the Sari speech. The emotional content was always lost in translation. What remained was the structure. "Attention, ISV Kander's Reach. You are in violation of Coherence Quarantine Protocol 9 regarding stellar body KV-Sothran 7. This zone is declared forbidden under Joint Coalition authority. You will withdraw to minimum safe distance immediately. This is not a request. Confirm compliance. On the signal feed, the visual was brief, but clear. The Thessari commander, senior rank, which meant the one moving least, stood at the center of his bridge, with both hands still at his sides, one fist pressed flat against his sternum in the formal confirmation gesture. His sensory crests, the ridge of sensory tissue that ran crown to neck along Thessari anatomy, were flat and controlled, perfectly composed. This was a being who issued orders and received compliance. The posture said it had never considered any other sequence of events. Voss looked at it for 2 seconds. Then he turned back to the star. Preth. Log the contact. Send acknowledgement. And compliance? Just acknowledgement. Preth sent it. The coherence vessel held position at the quarantine boundary. It did not advance. Voss noted that. They would not come in. They were certain enough in their authority that they did not believe anyone would deny compliance. He noted that too. Halvard had been running the radiation noise through signal filters for 4 hours before the transit from the quarantine boundary. The work was not glamorous. Stellar radiation at this proximity was a wall of interference. Thermal output, magnetic field fluctuations, particle emission, all of it overlapping in frequencies that made standard signal analysis useless. He had written 3 custom filter passes and thrown out the first 2. The third had found the shape inside the noise. Not a signal, not yet, just a structure. Something underneath the randomness that wasn't random. He had not told Voss when he found the structure. He had waited until he had the fragments, because bringing a commander, a shape without a meaning, was the same as bringing nothing. The fragments had come in sequence, separated by the star's irregular pulse intervals. Short, incomplete, like reading every third word of a sentence and having it still make sense. Holding, pause, pulse, static, pressure increasing, pause, pulse, static, successor required, pause, pulse, static. Halvard stared at it for a long time before going to Voss. Commander. Voss looked up. The signal. Halvard put the decoded fragments on the console between them. It's not random. Voss read it. How long has it been broadcasting? I can't determine origin duration, but the coherence quarantine file, the original one, 290 years ago. There are redacted sections. 3 of them. I think they decoded fragments too. Voss looked at the star and declared Protocol 9. Yes. They heard it and walked away. Halvard did not answer. The answer was in the file. Voss straightened up. Keep the filter running. Any new fragments, you bring them immediately. Yes, Commander. The rupture came without warning. Section 7, Bravo, mid-hull, port side, no collision, no breach alarm. The metal aged. That was the only way Skett could describe it in his damage report afterward. The plating aged, visibly in the span of 4 seconds. Color drained out of it. Stress fractures spread along the grain of the alloy in patterns that took decades of thermal cycling and micro-impact accumulation to produce. The section did not fail. It simply became 30 years older than it had been. Crewman Marit was working in that section. His tools fused to the deck. Not welded. Fused. The tool casing and the deck plating becoming a single continuous object without joint or seam, as if they had always been that way, and the idea of them being separate was the anomaly. Marit walked out of the section without his tools and went to find Skett. The transmission came in at 14:07:43 ship time. The Cander's Reach communications log would later show that the message had been sent by Cander's Reach at 14:18:55 ship time, 11 minutes and 12 seconds before it was transmitted. The content was 8 words. Hull buffer at threshold. Recommend immediate course correction. Voss read the timestamp 3 times. He did not show anything on his face. He filed it in the category of things that were happening and that he could not stop from happening, and he focused on what he could act on. Sket. Section 7. Bravo is compromised. I know. I'm looking at it. Can we seal it? Already sealed. Whatever happened in there, it stopped. For now. For now? That's what I said. Voss pulled up the navigation plot. The star's center, the gravitational core, where the signal was strongest, where the pulse originated, was deeper in. Significantly deeper. The radiation index would cross 12 before they reached it. Their shielding was rated to 6. He looked at the plot for some time. Preth. Adjust heading. Take us in another half-stellar radius. Preth turned in his seat. This was as close as the nav officer came to objection. The pause, the turn, the waiting. The shielding. Sket will manage the shielding. Adjust heading. Preth made the adjustment. Kander's reach pushed deeper into the corona. The star's pulse beat against the hull in irregular intervals. The display washed with light that had no business existing in the spectrum it occupied. The crew worked. They did not discuss what was happening to Section 7 Bravo or what the timestamp on the transmission meant. They had the particular discipline of people who had worked hazardous zones long enough to know that the most dangerous thing in a bad situation was not the situation. It was the conversation about the situation taking attention away from the work. Then Halvard's console chimed. He had been watching the filter output continuously as the radiation climbed and the noise shifted. The earlier fragments had repeated, the same sequence looping, waiting for anyone to hear it. These were different. They were responding. The signal had registered their approach. It had registered their course correction. It was not broadcasting anymore. It was answering. Signal refused. Signal refused. Signal refused! A pause longer than the pulse interval, long enough that Halvard thought it was done. You heard. Another pause. Shorter. Successor required. He pulled the full sequence and walked to Voss and put it on the console without preamble. Voss read it. His expression did not change, but he was still for a moment in a way he had not been still before, and Halvard understood that the commander was calculating something. Not the signal, not the star, but the distance between where they were and where this was going. It knows we're here, Halvard said. Yes. It knows the others didn't respond. Signal refused. 3 times. Halvard looked at the fragments again. It's been trying. Other species. They all got the same signal, and none of them answered. The coherence quarantine file, the redacted sections. 3 of them, Halvard said. At least 3 species received fragments before Protocol 9 was declared. Voss said nothing. He looked at the star. The coherence signal came in again. Keith Vaughn. Same formal tone, same tonal layering. The translation stripped out the emotional architecture, but the structure was unchanged. Withdrawal order, quarantine authority, non-compliance consequences. Standard. But Halvard was watching the visual feed this time. The Thessery commander was still in the way his rank required, but his sensory crests were not flat. They had shifted, a millimeter of movement along the forward ridge. In Thessery body language, Halvard had read, crest movement during a command communication was not supposed to happen. The crests reflected involuntary state. They did not lie. Which meant that Keith Vaughn was afraid, not of Kander's reach, not of human non-compliance, but of what the signal had just said, of the fact that it had changed. Halvard did not point it out to Voss. Voss had seen it. He always saw everything on the displays, and said half of what he thought about it. Kander's reach continued deeper. The star pulsed. The corona bloomed light in colors that the display rendered incorrectly because the sensors were not designed for what they were measuring. Section 7. Bravo held. The fused tools stayed fused. The clock on the communications log still showed a message sent 11 minutes in the future sitting in the received folder. Behind them, at the quarantine boundary, the coherence vessel did not move. It watched Kander's reach. But it did not follow. Kethvan's vessel moved first. Voss watched it on the rear display without comment. Kethvan had not crossed the quarantine boundary. The vessel stayed precisely where it was, stationary at 4 stellar radii, which told Voss everything about how the Thesari calculated acceptable risk. But from that distance, the deployment was impressive. 43 gravitational suppression drones launched in a coordinated spread pattern, accelerating on trajectories that curved around the corona's outer edge and converged toward the point where the star's light bent wrong in a formation that was, objectively, elegant. Each drone was the size of a shuttle. They moved like they had been doing this for centuries, which they probably had. Voss gave them 2 minutes before he said anything. Then he gave them 3. "Scat, watch the drone formation geometry." Scat pulled it up. Watched it. That's a good pattern. It is. Shame it won't hold. The drone formation broke against an environment it was never designed for. At the corona's inner boundary, where the drones were converging, the displays showed a region where the star's light did not behave like light. It bent back on itself, pooled in geometries that had no business existing, the plasma around it moving in directions that contradicted the stellar wind pushing it. Not a hole, more like a rupture, a place where the rules stopped. The Thesari models required confirmed geometry to function, and the rupture's boundary was producing none. The gravitational suppression fields from the lead drones intersected and found nothing stable to push against. The boundary shifted each time a field touched it, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. A centimeter of drift here, a frequency variance there. Small deviations that the Thesari AI registered and flagged, and then waited for confirmed parameters before compensating for. The parameters did not confirm. The AI waited. The drift compounded. At 2 minutes 40 seconds, the formation geometry broke. The drones did not fail. They slipped out of alignment. The fields stopped overlapping. The structure they formed, where each field reinforced the others, collapsed. Each drone was still active, but alone it did nothing. The rupture widened by 6% in 11 seconds. On the signal feed, Kethvan stood at the center of his bridge, unmoving in a way that went beyond command stillness. Something heavier, the stillness of a mind that had reached a conclusion it could not act on. His sensory crests were completely flat, without even the smallest movement. The drones began their recall sequence, orderly, precise. Even in failure, coherent systems executed cleanly. Voss turned away from the display. "Sket, the mining anchors, how many operational?" Sket's voice came from the port equipment bay. 14. 3 are questionable. I wouldn't trust them past 6 hours. Deploy the 11 solid ones. Spread pattern, wide perimeter. Don't try to cage it. What am I trying to do then? Sket asked. Frame it. Give the rupture edges to push against that don't move. A pause. That's not what anchors do. It is now. Sket stepped out of the equipment bay, gave Voss a nod, then went back in and started pulling anchors. The deployment was not refined. Mining gravity anchors were designed to lock asteroid bodies in place during extraction operations. Crude gravitational pins, functional and ugly, built for rock and ice, for environments where aesthetics were irrelevant. They weren't meant for stellar corona proximity or anything like this. Scat launched them in 3 groups, manually adjusted each trajectory from the bay controls, and swore continuously and specifically at the ones that drifted off heading in the corona's magnetic field variation. 2 of the 11 required mid-course correction burns that ate 20% of their operational fuel reserves. 1 anchor reached its position and immediately began tumbling on its axis because the gyroscopic stabilizer had not been rated for the electromagnetic environment, and Sket had known this and launched it anyway because 11 anchors in a rough perimeter was better than 10. The perimeter was not a cage. Voss had been explicit about that. It was a frame, 11 gravitational pins positioned not to contain the rupture, but to give it edges that would hold when it pushed back. The anchors didn't predict or calculate. They held with the mechanical stubbornness of industrial equipment. The rupture stopped widening. It pushed. The anchors registered the load and compensated with reserve power. There was nothing subtle about it. They screamed, a structural vibration that ran through the hull of Kander's Reach as a low, continuous tone the crew felt in their back teeth. But they held. "It's working," Preeth said, with the careful tone of someone who did not want to jinx it. "For now," Sket said over the comm. 3 hours on the good ones, maybe 4. Voss nodded. 4 hours. He looked at the star. Halvard had not looked up from his console since the operation began. The signal had changed again. Not the content, the behavior. After the anchor deployment, the fragments had stopped cycling through the status sequence and had begun arriving in a different pattern. Faster. More targeted. As if the system on the other end had registered what the anchors were doing and had updated its assessment of the receiver. He laid the new fragments out in sequence and read them the way he read everything, without assumption, without hoping for a particular meaning, just the words and the order, and the gaps between them. Anchor point valid. Mass insufficient. Pattern requires interior. Lattice interface accessible at core approach, vector 7. Transfer sequence available. Biological interface required. He studied the fragments for a moment, then began pulling the transfer sequence. It came in pieces, each one analyzed and fitted into place on his secondary display, forming a blueprint he assembled step by step, a technical document in a language he had never learned, but structured enough that the structure itself became the translation. The Sothran, the extinct civilization that had named the star, had built the stabilization lattice into its core, not attached to it, but threaded through it, woven into the plasma mantle so completely that the lattice and the star were functionally inseparable. The lattice was the star now, in the same way that the nervous system was the body. You could not remove one without ending the other. What remained of the Sothran control system ran on the lattice like a signal running on a wire, and the wire was dying. The transfer sequence was not instructions for building a replacement. The replacement was already built into the lattice. It had always been there, a secondary architecture, a successor system, designed from the beginning for the moment when the original Sothran intelligence could no longer maintain the signal. It required an active intelligence embedded in it, not operating it remotely, not interfacing through a control system at a safe distance, embedded, present, maintaining the control signal from inside the lattice continuously, because the lattice needed a live signal or the rupture's boundary would degrade. There was nothing passive about it. Continuous input, constant response to the rupture's pressure, adjustment without pause. If the boundary failed, the rupture would not simply expand. It would overwrite whatever it touched, replacing this side with whatever was pushing through. There were 3 interface nodes. The Sothran had used 3. The blueprint showed why single-point maintenance created failure cascades. 3 nodes created redundancy. 3 intelligences holding the signal in parallel, each compensating for the others, none of them able to leave. Halvard pulled the fragments together, confirmed the sequence, then walked to Voss. He brought the transfer sequence to the console and set it in front of Voss. Voss read it slowly, unusual for him, given how quickly he processed information and acted on it. The pace meant he was reading it twice. 3 nodes, Voss said. Yes, permanent interface. That's what the blueprint shows. There's no exit architecture. The Sothran didn't build one because Halvard stopped. Started again. I don't think they plan to leave. Voss looked at the crew roster on his secondary display. 31 names. He studied it the same way he had studied the transfer sequence. Slowly, carefully. How long to reach core approach Vector 7? At current heading, 6 hours. We'd need to adjust. Radiation index at that depth? Halvard checked. 14, possibly higher near the core interface points. Our shielding? Rated to 6. Voss nodded slowly. He closed the roster display. Keep decoding. Any new fragments? Show me immediately. Halvard went back to his console. The causality event began at 0914 ship time. There was no warning. Section 4, Alpha, forward cargo, 2 crew running an inventory check on the anchor reserve, simply slipped out of normal time. Voss saw it on the internal sensors first. The environmental log started repeating. 4 minutes of data looping, the timestamps advancing while the readings stayed the same. Then the loop broke. The timestamps jumped forward, and the 2 crew in 4 Alpha were gone. Not dead. Not in the section. Not anywhere on the ship's internal sensors. The distortion had been localized. Whatever happened there had taken them out of the ship's timeline. Voss stood at the console and looked at the gap in the sensor map where 2 human beings had been and were not. He did not speak for 10 seconds. Sket! Seal 4 Alpha. Already done. Sket's voice was calm. I saw it. Anyone else in adjacent sections? No, I checked. Voss went still, the tension visible in his posture. He entered the 2 names in the ship's incident log under the category that did not have a good term for what had happened to them. He used the closest available field. The star's pulse stuttered, not the irregular stutter it had been running since they arrived. Something different. A break in the pattern. A gap where there should have been a pulse, and then 2 pulses close together, and then another gap. Halvard was on it before Voss could ask. Lattice integrity, Halvard said. His voice was steady, but his hands on the console were moving fast. It's dropping. The anchor frame is holding the boundary, but the lattice itself, the internal signal, is degrading faster than the rupture boundary. The star isn't failing from the outside, it's failing from the inside. How long? Halvard ran the calculation twice. At current rate? 90 minutes to critical threshold. Maybe less. 4 hours had become 90 minutes. Voss processed that without showing it. The new fragment came in before he could speak. Time. Critical. Transfer now or pattern fails. Successor required. Halvard read it aloud, which he did not usually do. He did it because it needed to be in the air between them, not just on a display. Voss looked at the heading plot. Core approach, Vector 7. The star's interior. Radiation index 14 and climbing. He looked at the crew roster one more time. Praith. His voice was the same as it always was. New heading. Core approach, Vector 7. Best speed. Preth adjusted the heading. Kander's reach turned toward the stellar core and burned. The star's pulse beat against the hull in its broken, desperate rhythm. The corona closed around them. Light in colors the displays could not render correctly. heat that Sket was managing with patch jobs and stubbornness, radiation that was eating through shielding rated for half of what they were flying into. Behind them, at the quarantine boundary, the coherence vessel had not moved. The corona swallowed them whole. There was no gradual transition. One moment, Kander's reach was in approach. The next, the star was everywhere, filling every display, overwhelming every sensor. The ship's instruments producing numbers that the calibration systems flagged as impossible and then accepted because impossible was the only data available. The plasma mantle was not a surface. It was a depth. They were inside it, flying through stellar material at a temperature that Sket was managing through methods that would not appear in any operational manual, because no operational manual had ever needed to cover this. "Hull temp," Voss said. "Hi," Sket replied. "I'm managing it." "Sket." "Keeping us alive," Sket said. "That's the only answer I have right now." Voss did not ask again. The rupture's influence was different here. At distance, it had been reaching out, finding edges, testing. Here, it was ambient. Section 9. Bravo's lighting flickered, and when it came back, the shadows fell at wrong angles that had nothing to do with the light source positions. Preth's navigation display showed a star field that did not match any recorded position in the local cluster. Not rotated, not shifted, simply wrong. A view from somewhere else imposed over the real one. 2 crew in the engine compartment reported hearing a transmission on a frequency the ship did not have receivers for. When they wrote down what they heard, independently, the words matched. Nobody discussed it. There was no time and no point. The lattice interface coordinates came up on Holvard's display at 10:40 ship time, not from the ship's instruments, from the signal. The star was guiding them in, the fragments coming in a continuous stream now, short and directive, each one a course correction or a depth marker or a confirmation. Vector valid. Approach sustained. Node proximity increasing. Hold course. The nodes appeared on the electromagnetic scanner as 3 points of structured architecture inside the plasma mantle. Not natural formations, not stellar features. Constructed. Ordered. Precise in a way that had no place in a star's interior. The Sothran had built them to last. They had built them knowing the civilization maintaining them would eventually end. Something else would have to find them. And when it did, the nodes would need to still be there, still functional. They were there, and they were functional. The ship shuddered. A section of the ventral hull gave way. Not catastrophically. The emergency bulkheads caught it. But the loss registered on Sket's board as a cascade of red that he worked through without commentary, rerouting, sealing, compensating. 3 more crew were behind those bulkheads. They were not behind them anymore. Voss checked the crew roster. 17 had been remaining, 14 now. He logged it and kept moving. 11 minutes to the nodes. Voss pulled Halvard, Sket, and Orvit, the ship's environmental systems specialist, into the briefing alcove off the main corridor. No one else. The ship was loud around them. Stress sounds, repair sounds, the continuous low vibration of the anchor frame transmitting through the hull even at this distance. He did not sit down. Neither did they. He put the transfer sequence on the portable display and turned it toward them. No explanation. They had already read it. 3 nodes, he said. Permanent interface. No exit architecture. Halvard nodded. He had known since he decoded it. The hours since had been spent coming to terms with it. Not peace, but something usable. He understood the sequence, the cost, and where it led. He had decoded the signal, brought it to Voss, assembled the blueprint. The path from that first moment at his console to this one had been direct. He had known for some time that it ended here. Scat looked at the display for a long time. He was the oldest person on the ship after Voss, 51, a former deep-core infrastructure engineer, the kind of man who had spent his career keeping things from failing through stubbornness and practical knowledge. He understood permanent in a way most people did not. He looked at the node architecture and understood what it was asking for. He nodded once, and that was that. The third was Orvette, the environmental systems specialist. He had been there since departure, competent, quiet, present. 29. He looked at the display, then at Voss. Does it work? Voss said he believed it did. Orvette nodded. Then yes. He said nothing else. He wanted to know if it would hold, not if he would survive it. 4 minutes of silence that wasn't silence. The ship around them was constant noise. Hard suits, Voss said. Tethers. Manual approach to the interface layer. The nodes are in the outer plasma mantle. The suits are rated for the depth, barely for long enough. He paused. Long enough for the transfer. They suited up in the equipment bay without ceremony. Scat checked everyone's seals, including his own, twice. Halvard ran the tether lines through his hands, checking for stress damage. Orvette stood still and breathed evenly and waited. Voss watched them. Halvard looked at him. Commander. Someone has to get the ship out, Voss said. Flat. Preeth can't do it alone at this depth. I stay. You three go. Halvard held his gaze. It's an honor, sir. Voss put his hand briefly on Halvard's shoulder. 1 second. Then he stepped back. Go hold the line, he said. The interface was not transcendent. It was hot, and it was brutal, and the suit's thermal regulation was operating at maximum from the moment they exited the ship into the plasma mantle's outer layer. Tethers running back to the hull. The three of them moving through stellar material that wanted them dead in every physical sense, while the signal guided them forward in short, precise fragments that Halvard received through the suit comm. Left node, 40 meters. Center node, 60 meters. Right node, 40 meters. They split without discussion. Halvard left, Scat right. Orvette center. The longest approach, the hardest position, the one Orvette had taken without being assigned it, simply moving to it, because it needed someone, and he was there. The nodes were visible with naked eye at 10 meters, structures of Sothran architecture embedded in the plasma, geometric and impossible, holding their shape against stellar forces that should have erased them thousands of years ago. The Sothran had built them to endure. They had been waiting ever since. Halvard reached his node and put his hands on it, and the transfer began. He had expected something dramatic. He got something true instead. A connection, immediate and total. The lattice architecture opening around his cognition, like a space that had been measured for him specifically. Every parameter of his thinking, suddenly also the parameter of a control signal that had been running on dead protocols for centuries and was now running on something alive. He felt the rupture the way you feel a wall when you press against it. Solid, present, immense, pushing. He pushed back, not with force, with signal, with the continuous active output of an intelligence that the lattice had been designed to carry. The rupture's boundary held. From 60 meters away, through the plasma and the suitcom static, he heard Orvette say something brief that the interference fragmented. He heard Scat say nothing, which meant Scat was working, which was the same as Scat saying everything was fine. The lattice accepted all three. The signal stabilized. On Kander's reach, every instrument that was still functioning registered the shift simultaneously. Voss saw it on the main display. The lattice integrity reading, which had been dropping since they entered the corona, stopped dropping. Held. Then began climbing. Slowly, then faster, the transfer propagating through the Sothran architecture as the three human minds embedded in it learned the shape of the work, and the work calibrated to them. The rupture boundary on the electromagnetic scanner was contracting, not collapsing, sealing. The edges drew in, the breach narrowed. For the first time in years, whatever was on the other side met resistance, alive and holding, not mechanical and failing. Then the star let go. It did not explode. It shed. The plasma mantle released in a controlled sequence that the new lattice guided. The Sothran had planned for this too, had built the release architecture into the system for the moment when the stellar chassis was no longer needed and the lock could stand on its own. Mass peeled away in structured layers, the star diminishing, becoming less, the light changing from the irregular, stuttering pulse of a machine struggling to maintain itself into something quieter and final. The anchor drones were consumed in the outer layers of the release. They went without drama. 11 industrial gravity pins, ugly and functional and spent, erased by stellar mass that was finally going where stellar mass was supposed to go. Preth, Voss's voice, steady. Get us out. Preth was already moving, watching the release sequence, calculating the window, hands on the controls before Voss finished speaking. Kander's reach burned. The last of the drive capacity, reserves, emergency stores Sket had hoarded across the mission, now spent without him to object. The ship moved. The shockwave caught them at the corona boundary and threw them hard. Hull stress alarms flaring as 2 more sections went red on the board. Voss braced against the console, watching the structural integrity readings and running the calculations Sket would have made, knowing the ship would hold, because Sket had spent the entire mission making sure it would. They cleared the collapse zone. The star was gone. In its place, a gravitational structure, stable and dense, a new geometry where the rupture had been. Not a star. Not a black hole. Something the instruments did not have a category for, because nothing like it had existed before. The lock, humanity's lock. 3 human minds woven into Sothran architecture, woven into what had been a stellar core, maintaining a signal that held shut a breach in space-time, doing the work that an extinct civilization had done for thousands of years, and that every living species in this region of space had declined to continue. The transmission came from inside the structure 17 seconds after the collapse completed. 3 voices, indistinguishable from each other, the individual qualities already beginning to blur at the edges as the lattice integration deepened. Brief. Clear. Holding. 1 word. Present tense. Active. Voss stood at the console and looked at the display for a long time. Around him, the remaining crew worked damage control in silence. 11 people. The ship was functional. Barely, but functional. The star's last signal fragment arrived 4 seconds later, not from the new structure, but from the Sothran protocol itself, the final line of an automated system that had been running for millennia and had now completed its single purpose and was shutting down with the same precision that it had maintained everything else. Transfer complete. Thank you. The Sothran protocol went silent. Not dead. Silent. The difference mattered. Dead things did not choose silence. Voss read it twice. He did not show anything on his face. He saved the fragment to the ship's permanent log, flagged it at the highest priority level, and closed the display. 41 seconds after the seal completed, a pulse came from the other side of the rupture. It was not language, not a weapon, not an attack. Every instrument on Kander's reach registered it at once, a single coherent signal, structured, deliberate. Not the mindless pressure they had felt before, but something else. Something on the other side had encountered resistance and registered it. It knew what the Sothran had been. It registered what had replaced them. The pulse lasted 3 seconds. Then the instruments returned to baseline as the rupture boundary held and the new lock remained stable. The pressure from the other side was gone. It had stopped. Kander's reach drifted in the collapse zone, drives cooling, hull still radiating heat in the infrared. 11 crew doing what crew did after the worst thing they had ever survived. Working, because work was the only language that covered what there was no other language for. The coherence vessel came out of the quarantine boundary at reduced speed. No aggressive configuration this time. No weapon deployment. It crossed the line it had held for 3 centuries and moved into the collapse zone and fell into formation alongside Kander's reach without a word. Voss looked at the formation on the display. Kethvon's signal came in 10 seconds later. No tonal layering, no formal structure, no pressed fist gesture of command authority. Just the translation, flat and unadorned, stripped of every protocol that the Thessari used to mediate communication between ranks and species and certainties. What do you require? Voss read it. He thought about his crew. The ship that was barely a ship. The 3 voices that had said, holding, and gone quiet. He sent back 3 words. Escort. Nothing else. The coherence vessel held formation. Kander's reach began its transit out. The star was gone. Quiet at last, after 4,000 years of holding itself together. All because humanity was the one holding the line.